Miss Marple and the Dog That Never Barked Again. Chapter 1. The Bark. That was missing. It was a mild, late June evening in Little Davington. It's the kind of day when even the oldest windows were wide open, and the leaves of the lime tree in front of the church rustled, as if exchanging gossip with the bells. The rose bushes in the Weatherby's garden were in full bloom, and Mrs. Agatha Weatherby, devoted to 4 o'clock tea and good manners, had organized her traditional afternoon tea to raise funds for the restoration of St. Michael's stained glass window, which, by all accounts, had been in desperate need of restoration for over 30 years. The small courtyard behind the house was decorated with paper garlands. Hand-round tables covered with lace tablecloths held teapots, jam cake plates, and china cups once exclusive to Harrods. It was a strictly local affair, the kind that attracted everyone from the Anglican minister, Reverend Prowse, to the nosy Mrs. Gillibrand, who knew everything and judged everything with a restrained smile. Even Dr. Fanshawe had dropped in, which was unusual unless he needed to examine someone between sips of tea, and, of course, there was Miss Marple, sitting inconspicuously under a striped parasol, knitting something blue that looked like a sock, though no one dared ask for whom. She watched with that expression of hers, bright blue eyes, fixed on everything and nothing. Most assumed the old miss was simply listening to trivial conversations about prescriptions or digestive pills. But those who knew her knew that her mind was already registering small anomalies. Like a bloodhound without showing its teeth. It was then, at the edge of dusk, that a loud crash was heard. A squeal. No, something sharper. Bang. A thick, almost physical silence followed. It was interrupted by Mrs. Gillibrand, who put down her cup with a sharp, "Oh dear," as she saw the Weatherby's dog, the boisterous little terrier named Pickles, rush out of the back hedge with its tail tucked between its legs. "That's odd," Mrs. Weatherby said, raising an eyebrow. "Pickles never runs away from anything, not even thunder." But the dog didn't bark. He didn't whine. Just disappeared around the corner of the house without looking back. A young maid came running moments later, pale as a linen tablecloth. "Madame, Mrs. Weatherby, it's Mr. Denholm. He's in the library. ... He's not moving. ... The party ended, as all parties where death shows up uninvited usually do, with overturned chairs, stifled whispers, and a sudden collective forgetting of carrot cake. The body of Edward Denholm, the former town notary, widowed for 3 years, respected but dislikely, on the library's Persian carpet. Beside it, a heavy marble figure, a sleeping lion with a look of bored royalty, was smeared with something dark, a direct blow to the back of the skull. The desk showed no signs of a struggle. The bay window was locked from the inside. The Much Fordham police arrived with the haste of someone who didn't want to seem too interested. Led by Inspector Cribbs, a plump man with a dyed mustache and automatic suspicion of anything not local. "Unfortunate death," he said after a brief examination. "Okay, robbery, most likely. Where's the safe?" But nothing had been forced. Nothing was missing. Not even the collection of Roman coins that Denholm guarded with the tenacity of a pet dragon. Miss Marple stood in the doorway, watching silently without getting too close. "Did you notice anything strange this afternoon, Miss Marple?" the inspector asked, more out of politeness than hope. She blinked. "Sweet as powdered sugar. Nothing but the curious fact that Pickles ... didn't bark. And believe me, Inspector Cribbs, that little dog barks at a change in the wind." The inspector snorted. "A dog? Is that your observation?" "Oh, of course not. I also noticed that Mr. Denholm seemed to have had an intense conversation shortly before his death. His shirt was slightly disheveled, and there was a faint trace of perfume in the air. But don't take my word for it. I'm sure dogs and perfume have little to do with such a brutal murder." The inspector didn't know what to answer. Miss Marple looked toward the library, then out at the empty garden and down at her knitting needles. Something didn't fit. Not the crime itself, but its context. Because in Little Davington, even the deepest secrets were often hidden behind impeccable smiles. And, sometimes, overly quiet dogs. Chapter 2. Voices Behind the Curtains. The next day dawned with a soft mist hanging over Little Davington, as if the town refused to awaken from its confusion. In Mrs. Palgrave's bakery, the familiar aroma of freshly baked scones barely concealed the atmosphere thick with suppressed gossip. Mr. Denholm's murder had spread its ripples like a stone thrown into a very still pond in every conversation at the market, at the bus stop. Even between the church pews contained some version of the crime. It was probably just a passing thief, Mrs. Gillibrand murmured, stirring her tea briskly. Though, if you ask me, Edward Denholm always had enemies. It was said there were wills tailored to suit enemies, plied Miss Hartley, a retired teacher and a stickler for order. Well, I saw him having a very heated conversation with Martin Fleetwood just 2 days ago. The young man seemed out of his mind. Martin? Reverend Prowse chimed in, raising his eyebrows. Impossible. An impulsive young man, yes, but incapable of violence. Although, it's true that they were arguing over an inheritance, weren't they? Theory of a problematic will spread like an inkblot on a wet napkin. Miss Marple didn't participate in the gossip, though she listened. Sitting in the corner of the bakery with her usual knitting, she seemed absorbed in her sewing pattern. But if you looked closely, you'd notice that her eyes followed every word and every gesture with the precision of someone fitting together the pieces of a puzzle. "Have you ever noticed," he said, without looking up, "how, after a crime, people remember with absolute certainty conversations they barely understood while they were happening?" Mrs. Gillibrand straightened. "Are you suggesting we're exaggerating, Miss Marple?" "Oh no, dear. It's just funny how our memory tends to become more ... It's theatrical when tragedy hits the stage. Asterisk, asterisk, that same afternoon, Mrs. Weatherby allowed Inspector Cribbs to search the library more closely. The room was a capsule of Victorian order. Heavy wooden shelves, oak desk, a stained glass lamp, and a green velvet-upholstered armchair that creaked when one sat down. To one side of the desk, a heavy curtain hid the entrance to a small service corridor. Miss Marple, of course, had asked permission to leave a forgotten handkerchief, and happened to be present when the inspector discovered something unexpected. A sheet of paper, crumpled and torn at the corner, stuck between the wall and the skirting board behind the desk. Cribbs took it with a grain of salt. "A note," he murmured, but it was only the top half of a letter. Still, an intriguing sentence could be read. ... I won't allow it, even if I have to speak to her directly. You've already destroyed too much." There was no signature, no addressee. The inspector frowned and snorted. Pure nonsense. Who is she, and what has been destroyed? Miss Marple, standing by the door, gently stroked her chin. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "a woman doesn't appear on the scene because she isn't seen as a threat, and yet her absence weighs more than her presence." Cribbs looked at her suspiciously. "Are you implying that a woman wrote this?" "No, Inspector. I suggest that perhaps the letter was written by a woman." The inspector snorted, but put the note in a bag. Asterisk, asterisk. As night fell, Miss Marple walked slowly home along the hydrangelined path. Her mind replayed details that would seem minor to others. The sound of Pickles running but not barking. Denholm's wrinkled shirt, the sweet perfume wafting through the library. Now, that interrupted letter. The puzzle was just beginning to come together, but Miss Marple already sensed that the murder had nothing to do with material objects, but with old wounds, with hidden decisions that someone had considered irreparable. And he knew something else. In little Davington, where everyone pretended to lead harmless lives, the poison of secrets ran deeper than anywhere else. Chapter 3. A Divided Inheritance. The morning sun caressed the rooftops of little Davington with an unexpected warmth for the season. Mr. Denholm's death, though still recent, was already beginning to blend into everyday life, as all tragedies do in small towns. It was spoken of with a solemn air, yet with an almost festive tone. There was something fascinating in knowing that the murder had occurred just a few yards from one's own garden, or that one had shared a cup of tea with the deceased. Just days before, Miss Marple, however, walked with her usual measured gait, cane in hand, toward Dr. Fanshaw's office, not because of any illness of her own, but because of a talk she had promised to give him on behalf of her friend, Mrs. Bantry, whose blood pressure was rising with every start. Miss Marple, like everyone else, knew that the doctor had been one of the last to see Edward Denholm alive. Heart attack, the doctor was now saying in a low voice as he escorted her to the side porch. That's what I thought at first, until I saw the wound. Very clean, a single blow, directed. Miss Marple nodded, her lips pursed. And did you notice him nervous, doctor? Anything different about his behavior? I'd say so. He was agitated, but more than fear, he seemed furious. The funny thing is, he was carrying a folder, the same one he always used when dealing with important legal matters. He left it on my desk by mistake, although he came back for it less than 10 minutes later. In that time, I opened it. Guess I shouldn't have, but curiosity, you know? Oh, we're all vulnerable to it, Doctor, Miss Marple said with a gentle smile. And what was in it? Papers regarding a will amendment. It seemed he decided to change the primary beneficiary, to leave a good portion of his estate to a young woman, one named Clarissa. Miss Marple raised her eyebrows. Clarissa, with a last name. It wasn't listed, just Clarissa. The document was incomplete, as if she hadn't finished writing it yet. This introduced a new figure into the story. Who was Clarissa? A hidden lover? An illegitimate relative? Or, perhaps, an unknown protege? Asterisk later, while passing Mrs. Dillingham's cafe, Miss Marple had the good fortune, or rather, the carefully calculated intention to meet Martin Fleetwood, the young man with whom Denholm had, according to rumor, argued a few days before the crime. Martin looked like someone who hadn't slept well. Red-rimmed eyes, his shirt unbuttoned. At the neck, a nervous tick in the finger that tapped against the cup. "How's your mother getting on, dear?" Miss Marple asked pleasantly, approaching with her tray. "Calmer, thank you. She's had relapses this week, but can't help thinking all this hasn't helped," she murmured. "It must be difficult, with all this fuss. I suppose you had some unfinished business with Mr. Denholm." Martin looked at her with something between surprise and resignation. "The whole town knows, I suppose." "Yes," we argued. "It wasn't a secret. He was carrying my grandfather's will, and I discovered there was something strange. My grandfather always wanted the family home to stay in the family, but Denholm seemed determined to sell it. He said the new buyer had offered more than he expected. I told him it was a betrayal. He called me insolent. I called him ... someone who had to be stopped," Miss Marple added gently. Martin watched her with a mixture of respect and distrust. "I never thought he'd kill him. That's what he's implying. But he was up to something. He had secrets. He always had them." Asterisk. That afternoon, a notice posted on the door of the town hall went unnoticed by many, except for Miss Marple, who read it carefully. Denholm's notary office would remain closed until further notice, and his personal assistant, Miss Lydia Crane, had requested indefinite leave. "Funny," Miss Marple said quietly, folding her umbrella under her arm. "When the anchor comes loose from the ship, it's usually for fear of going down with it. Lydia Crane, the notary's efficient and quiet secretary, had been with him for more than a decade. In all that time, no one could remember a single inappropriate word, a single indiscretion. But Miss Marple knew something about people who simply observe. They're like cats. They see everything, okay? And often they remember it more vividly than you'd like. Asterisk, asterisk. The day ended with a brief drizzle and humid air that carried with it the scent of damp earth and freshly opened flowers. In her living room, beside a lamp with an embroidered shade, Miss Marple jotted down 3 names in a notebook: Clarissa, Martin, Lydia. He still didn't know which of them was hiding the truth. But he did know one thing. The dog hadn't barked because it had recognized the visitor. And in Little Davington, familiarity could be as lethal as a weapon. Chapter 4. The woman nobody mentioned. The sky above Little Davington remained overcast at dawn, with clouds that seemed to pretend a day filled with veiled revelations. The streets, normally quiet at that hour, were already filled with neighbors, finding excuses to be outdoors, like someone watering plants with an empty watering can or looking for yesterday's newspaper. They all shared the same concern. Who was this Clarissa? Miss Marple watched from her window without looking directly. The old woman knew well that in villages like this, selective silence spoke louder than words. If Clarissa had only been mentioned in a draft will and no one seemed to have heard of her, then she wasn't a mere stranger. She was someone many knew, but preferred not to name. After breakfast dose and a spoonful of blackcurrant, Miss Marple went for a walk. Her unofficial visit took her directly to the municipal library, a place frequented almost exclusively by absent-minded schoolchildren and Miss Elphinston, a librarian with the temper of a boiling kettle, loud, vehement, and somewhat prone to malicious innuendo. Clarissa, Elphinston repeated, adjusting his glasses on the end of his nose. Don't tell me you're also behind that story. No one's mentioned that name in years, unless, of course, one wants to stir up old rumors. I'm not one for scandal, my dear, said Miss Marple with a charming smile. But I am interested in human patterns. They always repeat themselves, you know. The librarian lowered her voice. She was Beatrice Mayberry's daughter. Do you remember her? She lived on the edge of town, in what's now the Widow's Asylum. Beatrice had the child out of wedlock. She never revealed the father's name, but we all had our theories. Clarissa left town at 17 after a scandal involving Colonel Warwick's son. No one ever saw her again. But there were always rumors that Edward Denholm was secretly supporting her financially. Miss Marple nodded slowly. The revelation wasn't shocking by her standards, okay? It was, in fact, predictable, and no one has heard from her since. Not that I know of, but Reverend Prowse might know more. He was very close to Beatrice before her death. He visited her frequently. Asterisk, asterisk, that same afternoon, Reverend Prowse received Miss Marple in the parish hall. The man, with his refined manners and always somewhat nervous in the presence of women with too many questions, seemed more uncomfortable than usual. Clarissa. Yes, I remember her well. She was an intelligent, lively, if somewhat reckless girl. She left after a misunderstanding. It wasn't entirely her fault. Young Warwick seduced her, promised to marry her, but her family intervened. Edward Denholm intervened, quietly. He ensured everything was kept out of the reach of the local press and offered a considerable sum to guarantee her a new start far from here. And do you think he maintained contact with her? I don't know for sure. Beatrice never spoke openly about it, but once, shortly before she died, she mentioned that Edward never abandoned what he considered his responsibility. It seemed to me to be a confession laden with meaning. Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing ahead. A girl banished because of scandal. A respected man burdened by guilt from the past. A young woman whose name appeared just as a will was about to be changed. **** Upon returning home, Miss Marple found a note under the door. An envelope with no return address, with her name written in a shaky hand. Inside, a single message. Don't trust Lydia. She knew more than she was letting on, and Clarissa isn't gone. There was no signature, no clue as to the author. But the choice of words was clear. He hasn't left. Clarissa was in little Davington. Somehow, silently, he had returned. ***, that night, as the grandfather clock struck 10 with its slow wooden beat, Miss Marple sat at her desk, pencil in hand. She drew a small diagram. In the center, she wrote 3 names: Edward Denholm, the dead man, bearer of ancient guilt; Clarissa, the absent figure, who, perhaps, had returned; Lydia Crane, the secretary who disappears just before everything falls apart around him. Tangle of relationships: young Fleetwood and his dispute, the amended will, the forgotten folder, the dog that didn't bark, the woman no one mentioned, but who now, without being present, permeated everything. Miss Marple closed her notebook, turned off the lamp, and allowed herself a sigh. The invisible, she thought, is more dangerous than the obvious. And when a shadow walks among people unseen, it's because many have already decided not to look. Chapter 5. Lydia and the Loyalty That Costs a Lot. The next day, the rain arrived without warning, like an unwelcome visitor who hadn't announced its arrival. The sky of Little Davington, now covered by gray clouds like closed curtains, seemed to reflect the general atmosphere of the town. The streets were half empty, save for the occasional hastily held umbrella. But even in the downpour, the rumors continued to circulate. Lydia Crane had disappeared, and everyone wanted to know why. Miss Marple wasn't intimidated by a little water. By mid-morning, dressed in her lavender raincoat and garden boots repurposed as urban footwear, she was walking toward Mrs. Vine's house, where Lydia had been renting a room for over 8 years. Mrs. Vine, a widow of fragile appearance but sharp tongue, greeted her with an expression of concern mixed with satisfaction. She loved being questioned, even more so if it was about something she could share before anyone else. "He left without saying goodbye," she said, placing a cup of tea in front of Miss Marple. "He left me the month's rent in cash, which he never did." Net was the strangest thing, because Lydia was methodical to a fault. She had everything written down, even what I owed the milkman in advance. "Did he mention where he was going?" Miss Marple asked, gently blowing on her tea. "No, but she was ... different, restless, as if she were waiting for something or someone. The night before she left, I saw her on the porch, standing in the rain, without an umbrella, just staring at the street, not moving. Do you remember if you received any unusual visitors those days?" "A man came looking for her. Didn't get a good look at him, but he had a dark hat and a deep voice, spoke quietly in the living room. I heard his name, ... hers. You can't hide it any longer, Lydia," was what he said. Miss Marple pursed her lips thoughtfully. The phrase wasn't ambiguous. It was a threat disguised as truth. After saying goodbye, Miss Marple headed to the Denholm notary's office. Although it was officially closed, young Constable Harper, whom Miss Marple had known since he was a boy in shorts and scraped knees, allowed her access, trusting his judgment more than her own. The office was covered with a patina of recent neglect. Dust was barely visible on the edges of the desk, documents still sorted by subject, and an empty chair that looked as if it had only recently been occupied. Lydia's personal file wasn't where it should be. No notes, no calendars, not even that small, red-covered notebook she always carried with her. But there was something else on the floor. Behind the wooden filing cabinet, Miss Marple saw a piece of paper folded in four. She delicately unfolded it and read, "If she's back, it's not for revenge. It's for justice." "I can't keep quiet any longer, Edward. Nor should you." It wasn't signed, but the handwriting was fine and tight. Mentally comparing it with letters she'd seen years before, church announcements, thank you notes, even shared recipes, Miss Marple had a reasonable suspicion the handwriting was Lydia's, so Lydia wasn't fleeing out of cowardice, but rather out of growing tension. Perhaps she feared that by staying, others would pay for her past silences. Asterisk. Later, at home, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. Martin Fleetwood, pale, with dark circles under his eyes, deeper than the day before, and his hands agitated with something other than anxiety. "Miss Marple, I need to speak to you. I don't know why, but I have the feeling you already know more than you're letting on." She invited him in with the same serene kindness with which she used to serve rhubarb compote to her most irritable guests. "I found a letter," Martin said, taking a folded envelope out of his jacket. "It was among the papers my mother kept in an old prayer book. It's from Edward Denholm, dated about 6 years ago, and it's about Clarissa." Miss Marple took the paper carefully. The letter was short but dense. "I have failed Clarissa more than once, not as a guardian, but as a man. Beatrice forgave me on her deathbed, but Clarissa hasn't. She ever returns. I hope she'll understand that I at least tried to make amends, however late. I've included her in the new will." "Lydia knows that." Miss Marple took a deep breath. The letter confirmed what she had already suspected. Clarissa wasn't simply an unexpected beneficiary. She was Denholm's daughter. Squaw, from being an emotionless secretary, had been the keeper of a secret that threatened to shatter all masks of respectability in Little Davington. "Thank you, Martin. What you did today was brave, but I beg you not to tell anyone else yet. These kinds of truths must be revealed with care." He nodded, and as he left, Miss Marple felt the pieces of the puzzle begin to fall into place. They didn't quite fit together yet. There were details missing, motives, and, perhaps, another shadow lurking closer than anyone dared suspect. But one thing was clear. Lydia hadn't disappeared out of fear of Clarissa. She'd left because she knew the truth was about to be revealed. And sometimes, loyalty costs a lot more than silence. Chapter 6. The Shadow in the Rose Garden. Evening fell with a melancholy laziness over Little Davington, as if the town itself needed to pause and think. The morning rain had made the air clearer, and the gardens were filled with the scent of damp earth and blooming flowers. But at the Weatherby house, where it all began, the beauty of the landscape failed to mask the simmering tension. Miss Marple walked along the gravel path in the back garden with Mrs. Weatherby, who looked uncomfortable, as if each step stirred not only the mud beneath her heels, but also memories she would rather not dredge up. "You sure you want to see the garden, Miss Marple? It's been so unsettled since that day." "My dear, that's exactly why. Sometimes what's out of place in a garden reveals as much as what's missing from a house," Miss Marple replied, stopping near the hedge where Pickles the dog had burst into in a panic on the day of the murder. The place was unusually quiet. There was no sound of the usual fluttering of birds or the squeal of the gardener's cartwheels. But Miss Marple wasn't looking at the ground or the plants. She was watching the lines of sight. The angle from the hedge to the library window, the blind spot in the ivy that covered the sidewall. "Has this hedge been trimmed since then?" Key asked gently. "Yes." Mrs. Weatherby hesitated. "The gardener did it on Tuesday. He said the dog had ripped some of the branches off while running. He didn't want it to look messy." "And did he notice anything strange? Footprints? A forgotten object?" "Not that he told me, although now that you mention it, he did say the dog barked like crazy at the hedge the next day, as if it smelled something still there. But it didn't find anything." Miss Marple bent slightly, brushing aside some leaves with the tip of her walking stick. There was something buried shallowly under the damp mulch. A scarf. It was soaked and stained with mud, but when she carefully pulled it out, she could still make out a discreet embroidery on one of the corners. C.F. Clarissa, Miss Marple murmured, more to herself than to her hostess. What do you say? Nothing, dear. I was just talking my mind, like older women sometimes do. Things that come with age, she added with a smile. Asterisk, asterisk. That night, back home, Miss Marple placed the scarf on blotting paper by the fire. The discovery was significant, but not conclusive. It didn't prove Clarissa's presence, but it did suggest that someone wanted to keep it hidden from view that she had been there. Or worse, never to be known, as the night wind gently tapped against her window pane. Miss Marple thought back. Clarissa had been banished years before, but the fact that she hadn't confronted anyone openly suggested she wasn't seeking revenge. Quote, not directly. Could she be watching from the shadows, waiting for the right moment? The sound of hurried footsteps outside interrupted his thoughts. He stood up, crossed the living room, and opened the front door a crack. Outside, in the mist, young Constable Harper was hurrying up the path. Miss Marple, he panted, must come with me. It's Mrs. Gillibrand. Someone broke into her house. She says it was a woman, that she was in her garden, that she left something on the table. Asterisk, asterisk. The scene at Mrs. Gillibrand's house was a small theater of chaos. Curtains fluttering. In the wind, a lamp knocked over, and the old woman in a dressing gown and curlers, holding a cup of lime tea like a shield. I didn't get a good look at her, she said, trembling. But she was young. Dark hair. She walked like she knew exactly where to go. She left this for me and disappeared, in my own house. On the table, among biscuit crumbs and scraps of embroidery thread, lay a sealed envelope. Miss Marple took it with firm hands, asked permission with a look, and opened it. Inside, single handwritten sheet. I don't want to cause any harm. I just want to know why they pushed me away. He owed me more than silence. There was no signature, but the handwriting was feminine, restrained, charged with an ancient emotion. Miss Marple nodded silently. Clarissa was there, not as a shadow, not as a rumor, as a real presence. And she wasn't seeking blind revenge. She was seeking truth. Asterisk, asterisk, back home. Miss Marple lit a lamp and sat down to write in her notebook. The mystery thickened like unstirred soup. She knew Clarissa had been at the Weatherby house. She knew she had left a message. She knew the past wasn't buried, but something was still missing. The motivation for the murder. Clarissa wasn't looking to kill, and Lydia had fled, not attacked. Who, then, had felt threatened by the mere possibility of Clarissa speaking out? Marple closed the notebook. She was no longer searching for the murderer among the secrets of the past. She was beginning to believe the key lay in who had the most to lose from the truth of the present. Chapter 7. The beneficiary who never smiled. The next morning dawned clear, with the kind of golden light that would normally brighten any village street. But in Little Davington, the air was still thick, heavy, with whispered whispers and glances that lasted a little longer than was acceptable. Clarissa's name floated through conversations like the echo of a ghost. No one dared to name directly. Miss Marple, as was her custom, remained outwardly oblivious to this social ferment. But inside, each new piece of information fit into a pattern that was beginning to take shape. Clarissa was there. Of that, there was no longer any doubt. But it wasn't her presence that worried Miss Marple. It was others' reactions to her. And there was one figure who hadn't yet been sufficiently questioned. The only known beneficiary of the old will, Martin Fleetwood. That afternoon, after an intentionally brief visit to the market, Miss Marple walked to the Fleetwoods' former residence, a red brick house with curtains that always seemed to be drawn half an inch too far. Martin stood on the porch, smoking a cigar with a somber expression. Seeing her, He made an effort to compose himself. "Miss Marple, have you discovered anything else?" "I hope so, dear," she replied with her most harmless smile. "I need to understand the will situation better." "Okay. You mentioned that your grandfather wanted the house to remain in the family. Could he put that in writing?" Martin hesitated for a second. He mentioned it constantly, but the document he signed wasn't that specific. Denholm drafted it and made sure it was as simple as possible. The house and part of the property would go to me. That was all. There didn't seem to be any other option until now. "And did you receive any legal confirmation after his death?" "Not yet. Everything stopped with the murder. But I knew that if anything happened to him, I would be the main beneficiary." Miss Marple watched him closely. There was something wrong with him. His distress seemed real, but not the kind born of grief. It was more like the anxiety of someone watching a sandcastle crumble under an unexpected wave. "And what did you feel when you found out about Clarissa?" Martin swallowed anger and shame, not for her, but for my mother. She trusted that we would finally be safe, stable, and now everything is in doubt. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Martin, dear, were you aware that Edward Denholm had been maintaining a kind of secret financial support for Clarissa for years?" Martin shook his head. "No, but I'm not surprised. Denholm was the type to do the right thing, but it was too late." Miss Marple nodded and changed her tone. "Would it hurt you a lot to lose the house?" Martin did not immediately respond. "It's not the house," he said finally. "It's the beginning of things. Okay? My mother has suffered so much. Okay? So have I. The idea that everything we hope to build could be ruined by a figure from the past. It hurts. Not because Clarissa doesn't deserve it, but because we, too, have waited for justice." The answer, though measured, didn't give Miss Marple what she was looking for. But it did reveal something else. Martin was impulsive, yes, even resentful. But he wasn't driven by hatred. He was driven by fear. That afternoon, Miss Marple decided to consult again a source who was often underestimated in the more respectable circles of the town. Mrs. Dillingham, owner of the cafe and possessed of an ear as sharp as that of a street cat. "Clarissa," the woman repeated, serving a generous slice of lemon cake. "She's back, though no one wants to say it out loud. There's a young woman renting a room in the old mill. She pays cash. She calls herself Miss Vale, but I saw her as a child." Clarissa Mayberry had that same way of turning her head, as if every question were a threat. "And have you spoken to anyone in the village?" "With almost no one. She only comes for bread and some fruit. Quiet, observant, and sad. It's a sadness that doesn't come from poverty. Something else, as if she carries a very long history behind her." Miss Marple felt the knot at the center of the mystery begin to loosen. Clarissa wasn't hiding. She was just waiting. But then, who had felt threatened by her? That night, as she reviewed her notes, Miss Marple returned to where she started. The murder. A single, precise blow, with no sign of a struggle. The library locked from the inside. The dog that didn't bark. And above all, a beneficiary who knew his place could be challenged. But Martin wasn't the only one with something to lose. There was one figure missing from the rumors, the investigations, the comments. Martin's mother, a woman invisible to the public, confined due to nervous illnesses that no one could fully confirm. And yet, she was the one who had been closest to Denholm for years, according to everyone, for family reasons. What if that closeness was hiding something else? Miss Marple underlined a name in her notebook. Margaret Fleetwood. If Clarissa claimed, what was hers? Who was she really depriving? And most importantly, who was afraid enough to kill in silence? Chapter 8. The Sick Woman Who Never Received Visitors. From the outside, the Fleetwoods' house didn't suggest much. Red brick, heavy curtains, a well-pruned but unloved garden. But Miss Marple knew that facades can be deceptive. And in her experience, houses where people boast of being tidy often hide some corner that's too quiet. That corner, in this case, was Margaret Fleetwood. Few people in Little Davington spoke of Martin's mother. It was said that she had been ill for years, the victim of a nervous breakdown following the death of her husband. Some claimed to have seen her in a wheelchair. Others believed she no longer left her bed. The truth was that she hadn't been seen in public for over a decade, and the only ones who entered her room were Martin and, very occasionally, Dr. F.A.N.S.H.A.W.E. Miss Marple. Under the pretext of returning a book to Martin, rang the doorbell shortly after 4 in the afternoon. It was the ideal time for social calls, and, at the same time, the time when people usually let their guard down. Martin opened the door with a frown. "Has anything been offered to you, Miss Marple?" "Little reindeer," she replied with a gentle smile, pointing to her umbrella and a forgotten book. "Okay. Also, if it's not too much trouble, I'd like to say hello to your mother. I haven't seen her for so many years." I suddenly remembered we used to have very interesting conversations about Flemish lace embroidery. Martin seemed to hesitate. He swallowed. "She's very delicate." "Oh, I don't mean to upset you." A moment of friendly face. "Maybe it'll do you good." After a few seconds, he agreed. "It's upstairs, second door on the right. But please, don't shake it too much." Miss Marple went upstairs slowly, like an innocent guest. The hallway carpet was thick, and her walking stick made little sound. When she opened the indicated door, she found herself in a dimly lit room. Blinds were drawn, a cloth-covered mirror, and a faint scent of musty lavender. In bed, propped up on pillows, was Margaret Fleetwood. He was younger than Miss Marple had expected. His face, though pale, showed no signs of advanced illness. His lively eyes studied her with the sharpness of someone who had long since stopped trusting her surroundings. "Miss Marple," he said, without surprise, "I didn't think you'd come to see me. Hardly anyone does. Old friends shouldn't be forgotten so easily, Margaret. Sometimes remembering can be more healing than resting." There was a thick silence. Margaret looked down at their clasped hands. "Are you here for Edward?" "I come for the truth." Margaret gave a short laugh, dry as an autumn leaf. "I don't know what truths you hope to find. He's gone now. He took all his secrets with him. Not all of them. Some are more alive than ever." Margaret looked up, and in her eyes there was a trace of something old. Not guilt, but resentment. "He promised. He promised that everything would be for Martin, that the past wouldn't matter, that everything he did for that girl would be buried. Clarissa." Margaret's face hardened. She had no right to come back. Not after what she caused. Not after what she forced me to endure. Miss Marple approached calmly. "Did you know that Edward had changed the will?" Margaret nodded, very slowly. "I discovered it by accident. I overheard Lydia arguing with him one night. She begged him to wait, not to do it, okay? That her reputation would be ruined. But he'd already made up his mind. He wanted to clear his conscience. Years too late. And what did you do?" Margaret looked at her directly. Her voice trembled, not from weakness, but from suppressed emotion. "I wrote to him. I asked him to reconsider, to think about Martin, to think about me. He answered me coldly. He said he couldn't keep covering up the decisions he'd made 20 years ago. That Clarissa had the right." Miss Marple bowed slightly. "Were you the one who left him that note we found crumpled up in the library?" Margaret blinked in surprise. Then she looked down in defeat. "Yes, but I wasn't the one who killed him, if that's what you want to know." "And what about Lydia?" Margaret hesitated. She was loyal until the very end, but she was also afraid. She knew that if Clarissa came back, everything that had been quietly built would crumble. Miss Marple was silent for a few seconds, processing every word, every nuance. "You're not as sick as everyone thinks, are you, Margaret?" She didn't answer. Asterisk, asterisk, leaving the house, Miss Marple walked silently through the light drizzle that was falling again over the village. Her intuition told her that Margaret hadn't killed Edward Denholm, but she also knew that the crime wasn't just an act of rage. It was a cold, calculated decision, motivated not by hatred, but by the preservation of something or someone. And in that house, between the silent mother and the son with dashed hopes, someone had crossed the line of what was justifiable. The past wasn't dead. It had returned, and with it, Clarissa, but not as a threat. Rather, as a mirror. The mirror that forced everyone to look at themselves. Chapter 9. The second night without barking. Little Davington seemed to be holding its breath that night. The streetlights cast long shadows on the wet cobblestones, and the windows, usually bright and cheerful, were mostly unlit. Only a faint light in a distant room broke the uniformity of silence. For those who paid attention, as Miss Marple always did, was clear that something was brewing beneath the village's quiet surface. Something that was nearing its culmination. Pickles, the dog, hadn't barked either since Edward Denholm's murder. That little terrier had been restless. He would bark at any shadow, any insect, anything that moved. And yet, on the two key nights, the night of the crime and the night before its discovery, he had remained completely silent, as if he recognized the presence, as if he knew better than to raise an alarm. Miss Marple, sitting by the window with a cup of tea in her hands, went over each loose thread of the plot. The pieces of the puzzle were almost all in place. Lydia's disappearance, Clarissa's appearance, Margaret Fleetwood's bitterness, Martin's fear, and the note written in a trembling, desperate hand. But something was still missing. A connection. The final move in a silent game that had been playing out for decades. And then it happened. A sharp knock. Not on his door, but on the one next door. The house next door to Miss Marple's. It's a small stone dwelling that had been unoccupied for months. Now revealed a figure moving inside. And, seconds later, a faint sound. The turning of a key. The creaking of an inner door. And again, silence. Pickles didn't bark. Miss Marple stood up quietly, crossed the living room, and leisurely picked up her coat. She didn't turn on any lights. She opened the front door as calmly as someone goes down to fetch a glass of water. And she walked to the Weatherby gate, where Pickles was sleeping, snoring softly. The dog, seeing her, raised his head. His ears twitched, but he didn't bark. "You know who it is, don't you, little one?" Miss Marple murmured, bending down to stroke his back. "You know who comes and goes without fear?" Asterisk, asterisk. The empty house, according to the municipal register, had been rented 5 days earlier under the name Clara Vale. A false name, of course. Clarissa was back, hiding right next to the one person who probably wouldn't judge her, Miss Marple. Next day, without drama or fanfare, Clarissa knocked on his door. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice calm. She was a woman in her 40s, slim, with a firm face, and dark eyes that seemed to have seen far more than anyone could imagine. She wore a gray coat, and her hair was pulled back in a simple bun. She didn't look nervous. She didn't look scared. Just ... determined. "Of course, dear," said Miss Marple without surprise. "Tea?" "Yes, thanks." They sat in the living room in the dim morning light. The clock on the wall read 11. Miss Marple poured the tea with precise movements, as if it were any other social call, while Clarissa looked at the old paintings on the shelf, as if searching for traces of a past that wasn't hers, but that rightfully belonged to her. "I know everyone thinks I came here for the money," she said finally, "but that's not true. I'm not interested in the inheritance. I never was. I came here because I wanted to look Edward in the eye. I wanted to ask him if he ever, in all these years, saw me as his daughter." Miss Marple nodded slowly. And he did it. Clarissa smiled sadly. I didn't get there in time. Lydia told me to wait a few days, that it wasn't ready yet, that there were things to fix. And then he died. Just like that. Did you talk to Lydia afterward? Once, he told me he'd left town for my own good, that someone knew I was here, that not everyone would accept my return. Who? Clarissa hesitated. He didn't want to tell me. It just wasn't safe for me. And he disappeared. Asterisk, asterisk. Miss Marple poured a new cup and placed it in front of her guest. Clarissa, where were you the night of the murder? In my room, in the empty house. I didn't go out. I didn't know what had happened until the next morning, when I heard Mrs. Gillibrand scream that there had been a murder. Are you sure no one saw you come in or go out? Yes. I don't know anyone in this town. No one would recognize me. Miss Marple was silent for a few seconds. Then she smiled kindly. Someone did recognize her. Pickles. Clarissa looked at her in bewilderment. The dog. Oh, he barked at everyone, except for 2 nights. The night before the murder and the night of the crime. He didn't bark, 'cause he'd done it before, because he'd already smelled you. Because you were the only one who petted him before he hid. Clarissa didn't reply, but she didn't deny it either. I didn't hurt Edward. I know, Miss Marple said calmly. Someone wanted us to think you could have done it. Asterisk, asterisk. After Clarissa left, Miss Marple was left alone in the living room. The pieces had finally fallen into place. The buried scarf, the notes, the dog's silence, Lydia's disappearance. The letter Martin had found. There was just one last move left, because if Clarissa had come back for the truth, then someone else had killed to bury her again. And that person, Miss Marple thought, wasn't finished yet. Chapter 10. Last Tea with Pickles. The air had a hint of farewell that afternoon. It wasn't so much the temperature, which remained mild, nor the wind that barely touched the hedges. It was a different feeling, as if the town itself sensed that something was about to be revealed. Miss Marple, however, didn't let on even the slightest urgency. That afternoon, as if everything were in its place, she invited Mrs. Weatherby to tea in the back garden. Pickles, of course, was asleep at her feet. I'm surprised you're so calm, Miss Marple, Mrs. Weatherby commented as she stirred the sugar. With all this going on, I couldn't sleep a wink. Oh, my dear, well-poured tea and a quiet dog are the best soothers for the soul, Miss Marple replied, looking out at the horizon with an almost thoughtful expression. In reality, this meeting was no coincidence. Miss Marple had requested that other guests come. Little by little, they arrived. Reverend Prowse, Mrs. Gillibrand, Inspector Cribbs, Kay. Finally, Martin Fleetwood, accompanied to everyone's surprise by his mother, Margaret. Mrs. Fleetwood walked slowly, but unaided. She didn't use a cane or a wheelchair. Her mere presence shattered the image that had surrounded her for years. A murmur spread among the guests like a breeze through leaves. Miss Marple, what's the point of this little meeting? Cribbs asked curiously. She gently put down her cup. I thought it would be good to share some final observations. After all, this mystery has troubled everyone, and I believe the truth is always better when shared. With witnesses, those present exchanged awkward glances. Only Pickles seemed unfazed. It all began, Miss Marple continued, with something that night happened. The dog didn't bark. That absence told me more than any presence. It meant that whoever entered the library that night was someone familiar to him. And that proves anything, Cribbs interrupted. Not by itself, she admitted, but it was the first token in a long chain. Then came the letters. One of them, written by Edward Denholm, spoke of a forgotten daughter, Clarissa, but the other, written with suppressed emotion and signed nameless, pleaded that all that had been achieved not be ruined. That one was written by Margaret Fleetwood. Margaret looked up, not surprised, but with a new stiffness in her jaw. Yes, I admit it. I wrote it, but I didn't kill him. No, said Miss Marple. He didn't, but he did tell his son. Silence fell. Like a slab, not Martin, tense, opened his mouth. Damn, and then closed it. Your mother told you that Clarissa had returned, Miss Marple continued, that Edward had decided to change the will, that all those years of hope, of effort, of sacrifice could be swept away by a stranger. You, Martin, felt that you were not just losing the house. You were losing your meaning, a purpose, your identity. Martin looked down. Mrs. Gillibrand covered her mouth with her hand. You didn't plan it. Not at first, but that night you entered the house. Not to kill, but to talk. But you met resistance, an argument, maybe a struggle. The marble lion was decorative, but heavy. It was right there, next to the desk. Reverend Prowse closed his eyes. As if, in silent prayer, you cleaned up enough to make it look like an interrupted robbery. But you weren't a thief. You were a desperate man. The one the town never saw as a threat, because they always saw him as a victim. Martin was breathing heavily. His mother took his hand. I didn't want to. ... He finally murmured, trembling. I just ... I just wanted him to understand he couldn't do that he couldn't turn his back on us. But he started yelling at me. He called me a coward. He said I had no right to anything, and you acted, Miss Marple said gently. A second, in a fit of rage, not with hatred, with desperation. And then you tried to go back to your life as if nothing had happened. I did it for her, Martin said, looking at his mother, for everything that man took from us. Margaret didn't cry, but she pressed her lips together tightly. She didn't defend her son. She didn't justify him, spiked. She just looked at him with the pain of someone who knows that absolute protection always comes at a price. Cribbs stood up slowly. Martin Fleetwood, he said gravely, I'm informing you that you're in custody for the murder of Edward Denholm. Martin didn't resist. He walked silently to the inspector's car. Asterisk, after everyone had left, Miss Marple was left alone with Pickles. The terrier got up, walked in a circle, and lay down beside her, letting out a soft sigh. You didn't bark that night, did you, little one? Because danger doesn't always come from strangers. He stroked her head tenderly as the sun set, turning the sky a dull pink. The crime had been solved, but the wounds in little Davington would take a long time to heal. Sometimes the past returns, not as punishment, but as a mirror. And when you can't bear your reflection, that's when tragedy strikes. Chapter 11. Clarissa in the garden she never forgot. In the days following Martin Fleetwood's arrest, little Davington descended into a silence thicker than any previous scandal. The church bells rang with a strange restraint, as if even their ringing preferred not to disturb the fragile calm that now enveloped the village. No one spoke Martin's name aloud, but everyone thought of him, of the unexpectedness of his downfall, of how the crime had hidden itself in a familiar face, in an ordinary life. Miss Marple, as always, maintained her routine: short walks, cup of tea at 4, and a careful review of her correspondence. But there was one thing she still had to do, one last piece of humanity amid the shadows of crime. Clarissa. That afternoon, she strode briskly across the path to the old mill, where Clarissa was still staying under the name Clara Vale. She didn't mean to question, but to offer something few in little Davington knew how to give: unconditional understanding. Clarissa opened the door without surprise. She was dressed simply, as always: a white blouse, a gray skirt, her hair loose, and her face serene, but with an expression that only experience could shape. I knew it, she said before Miss Marple could speak. I knew it from the moment Martin looked at me in the bakery, pretending he didn't know me. to prove it, or what to do with it. There are silences that protect, Miss Marple replied, and silences that bury. You lived under the first. He, I'm afraid, fell into the second. Both women walked toward the mill's small back garden. There, in the dim light of the evening, grew a few old rose bushes, forgotten by previous tenants, but now reviving with timid dignity. You know, Clarissa said, touching the petals of a withered rose, I used to come here as a child. When my mother worked at the doctor's house, I would spend the afternoons picking flowers from the hedges. I used to imagine that one day I would have a garden of my own. Not big, not fancy, just mine. And now you have it, said Miss Marple, watching her fingers stroke the stem carefully, avoiding the thorns. Clarissa nodded, but without a smile. It's not how I imagined it. It's not with this history behind it. It's not with the blood that dragged my name. Back, Miss Marple sat on a moss-covered stone bench. You didn't bring the blood, Clarissa. You were dragged away by those who feared what your presence meant. Edward Denholm, in his final days, tried to repair damage he had left unattended for too long. Maybe he didn't do it entirely well, but he tried to take a step toward the truth, and that step cost him his life. Sometimes repentance comes late, but it can still bear fruit, Miss Marple said gently. You're alive and free. That's no small feat. Clarissa sighed, looking up at the cloudy sky. So, what now? Am I supposed to stay here, among those who whisper my name as if it were a curse? Not everyone whispers. Some observe. And in time, they will learn. Because the truth, however uncomfortable, settles like rain on dry earth. And sometimes it blooms. Clarissa didn't reply, but for the first time, a small line of tenderness softened her lips. She walked to a corner of the garden where a young rosebush sprouted among the stones. She took a small gardening spade from her pocket and began to dig slowly. I'm going to plant a new one, he said, white, like the ones my mother used to put in milk jugs by the window. Miss Marple watched her silently. She knew that this act, simple, silent, almost invisible, was more significant than any speech. Clarissa wasn't looking for revenge or redemption. It's a place to grow without hiding. When she finished planting, Clarissa wiped her hands with a handkerchief. Do you think I'll ever belong here? Miss Marple smiled, getting up with the help of her cane. My dear, this town belongs as much to you as to anyone else. And now, more than ever, it needs its new roots so that the old ones don't rot. Asterisk, asterisk, that evening. Back home, Miss Marple closed her notebook. All the names were there. Edward, Lydia, Margaret, Martin, Clarissa. Beside each, a small symbol, a stroke, a word that summarized what she had learned. At the end of the notebook, where she would normally jot down her final thoughts, she left the page blank, because not everything could be summed up in letters. Outside, Pickles barked just once, strong, determined. Then he fell silent. Miss Marple smiled slightly. Sometimes dogs need time to trust the noise of the world again. Chapter 12. A Flower for Edward. The following Sunday dawned warm and clear, as if the weather had also decided to close a chapter in little Davington's history. The entire village seemed quieter than usual, not out of fear or suspicion, but rather a resigned calm that only comes when the truth has come to light and can no longer be relegated to obscurity. In the church, Reverend Prowse delivered a sermon on forgiveness and second chances. He spoke without naming names, but his tone grave, sincere, spoke more than any explicit confession. In the pews, the usual faces maintained careful composure. Mrs. Gillibrand sighed more heavily than necessary. Mrs. Weatherby kept her lips pursed, as if holding back an unsolicited opinion. And at the back, sitting in one of the side pews, was Clarissa, not hidden, not disguised. Clarissa Mayberry, finally visible. Miss Marple greeted her with a slight nod. The young woman responded in kind. Hey. And in that exchange of glances, there was something more powerful than any words. The recognition of a shared truth, and of a wound that, though it would never fully heal, at least was no longer hidden. After the service, the townspeople dispersed with a mixture of respect and caution. Some glanced at Clarissa out of the corner of their eyes, others with a slight nod. No one confronted her, no one hugged her. But in a town like Little Davington, not turning your back was a good start. Asterisk, asterisk, that afternoon, Miss Marple walked alone to the cemetery. She carried a small bouquet of flowers, 3 clean white roses, freshly picked from her garden. She placed them in front of Edward Denholm's newly carved gravestone. It didn't yet have a date engraved on it, but his name was already there, dried on the stone. You did the right thing. Too late, the old woman murmured. But you're not the only one to make that mistake. He remained silent for a few minutes, as the wind stirred the leaves of the nearby oak. He thought not only of the man lying underground, but of all those who had been swept up in his past. Lydia, who had kept a secret too big for herself. Margaret, who transformed abandonment into justification. Martin, whose fear disguised as duty drove him to cross a line of no return. And Clarissa, the only one who asked for nothing, but whom everyone seemed to fear. Asterisk, asterisk later. Back at home, Inspector Cribbs visited her. He entered without formality, placed his hat on the coat rack, and accepted a cup of tea with a mixture of gratitude and resignation. I don't know how you do it, Miss Marple. One of my men suggested you have hidden microphones all over the village. Oh, that's not necessary, Inspector. People are their own microphones. You just have to listen carefully, she replied, pouring tea with methodical movements. Martin confessed everything, said he didn't plan to kill, but that he lost control, that his mother incited him out of fear, and that he believed he was doing it for her and Lydia. He showed up this morning at the Much Fordham train station. He turned himself in. He said he couldn't run anymore, though he insisted he had nothing to do with the crime. He was just trying to protect Clarice and Edward, right up to the end. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Sometimes protecting means keeping quiet. Other times it means knowing when to stop. And Clarissa. Do you think she'll stay? I don't know, Inspector. But he planted a white rose bush. That's usually a sign of permanence, he said with a slight smile. Cribbs was silent for a few seconds, then stood up. I won't say it in front of the press, but I'm glad you were here. Even if cases are solved with evidence, motives often elude us, and that only you can see that. She didn't respond. She just walked him to the door, gently tapped him on the shoulder, and closed it behind him with the serenity of someone who's seen too many springs to be impressed by just one. More, asterisk, asterisk, at dusk. Miss Marple went out for her usual walk. She passed the empty Denholm house, where the curtains were still closed and the gate rusted. Then she crossed by the mill, where Clarissa was silently watering the garden. They exchanged a glance. They said nothing, but at that crossing, there was an unspoken promise. Life would go on, and with it, the slow work of blossoming among ruins. Pickles, from the Weatherby's garden, saw her pass and let out a short, low bark. Just one. Not a warning, not an alarm, just a simple sound. Alive, Miss Marple stopped, gave him a smile, and walked on under the violet evening sky. The crime was solved. The damage was done. But there was also new seed in the soil, and that, for her, was enough.